Hello students, this video is a summary of Chinua Achebe's essay Colonialist Criticism selected from his collection of essays Hopes and Impediments. In this essay, Achebe traces the history of colonization of Africa. Achebe says there was trade between Africa and Europe, which led to prosperity of Europe and America. Achebe writes about the missionaries who came and changed the world of Africans, and also of colonial powers who enslaved Africans. Achebe mentions the national movement which led to the liberation of Africa. Achebe writes that the European critics still consider African literature with a big brother arrogance and think that African literature is underdeveloped as there is much to learn from European masters to reach perfection. Achebe demonstrates this attitude by quoting several examples. Achebe also writes that Europeans and African literature are different as their primary focus is different and cannot be compared. African literature should not be demeaned as we can find examples in art and music which justify the exemplary creativity of African writers. Now, let us see the analysis of some passages from the essay. Achebe begins the essay by saying, is the word colonialist inappropriate? Does it have still the same meaning as it used to have in the past, or is it relevant today? He says, the word colonialist may be inappropriate for two reasons. First, because it has come to be associated with cheap, demagogic, and outmoded rhetoric. It implies that time has come when we must assume responsibility for our problem and our situation in the world and resist the temptation to blame other people. That means the Africans are now independent and they should become more and more responsible for their actions. They are self reliant and they should not depend on the colonial powers anymore. Therefore, the word colonialist becomes inappropriate. The second reason he gives is whatever colonialism may have done in the past, today there are events like Commonwealth Conference, which is a symbol of new relationship of equality between people who were masters and servants. Now there are many opportunities for writers all over the world to present their creations, and there is the promise of equality between people, Europeans and Africans. So the word colonialist may not have the same meaning as it used to have earlier. But in the very next paragraph, Achebe says that the word is still relevant, it is still there even today. Criticism towards African literature derives from the same basic attitude and assumption as colonialism. So it continues to stay in the world because the European critics who review and criticize African literature are doing it with the same attitude that the colonialist powers used to have. This attitude and assumption was crystallized in Albert Schwitzer's immortal dictum in the heyday of colonialism, I quote, "The African is indeed my brother, but my junior brother," unquote. So, what does it mean? The Europeans thought that Africans can never write as they do. And there is some imperfection, there is something which is lacking in the work of African writers. The latter day colonialist critique, equally given to Big Brother arrogance, sees the African writer as a somewhat unfinished European who, with patient guidance, will grow up one day and write like the European. So, the European writers should give guidance to the African writers. The African writer cannot write in the same way with the same perfection as the Europeans do. So they are unfinished Europeans who need guidance to grow up, and after a long time they will be able to write as the Europeans write. But meanwhile, they must be humble, they must learn all they can and give due credit to his teachers in the form of direct praise or self contempt. So, this has to be the attitude of African writers. Chinua Achebe remembers how his first book received a very unusual review from a woman by the name Honor Tracy. The woman asked how could Achibe go back to the mindless times of his grandfathers when he already has a job at broadcasting at Lagos, and that his description of African culture was insincere. So, according to Achibe, there are three parts of colonial criticism. First is Africa's inglorious past, to which Europe brings the blessing of civilization. The past of Africa was something which did not have anything good or important in it, and it was the Europeans who brought the light of civilization to the darkness of Africa. And now, instead of being grateful, Africa has become ungrateful. It is the ingratitude of Africa that irritates the Europeans. For this, what the colonial powers claim is that they have deeper knowledge and they are able to perform a more reliable appraisal of Africa than the educated writer is capable of. To the colonialist mind, it was always of the utmost importance to be able to say, "I know my natives," a claim which implied two things at once. A, that the native was really quite simple, and B, that understanding him and controlling him went hand in hand. Understanding being a precondition for control, and control constituting adequate proof of understanding. Now, the colonial powers knew from the very beginning that they should have a good knowledge of Africa and its people. If they had that knowledge, then only they could exercise control over them. Thus, in the heyday of colonialism, whenever there was a serious incident of native unrest, there used to be an occasion not only for pacification by soldiers but also for a royal commission of inquiry. So, the colonial powers always saw to it that they made a thorough study of the psychological beliefs of the native people. Meanwhile, a new situation was slowly developing as a handful of natives began to acquire European education and then to challenge Europe's presence and position in their native land with the intellectual weapons of Europe itself. So, after a long time of colonial oppression, some natives began to get educated and they started writing in the language which the colonial powers used. To deal with this phenomenal presumption, the colonialists devised two contradictory arguments. He created the man of two worlds theory to prove that no matter how much the native was exposed to European influences, he could never truly absorb them. So, the colonial powers began to make two groups among the native people, one of the uneducated people and the other intellectuals. So they, according to their theory of man of two worlds, you would never know when the educated native at any time can discard the mask of civilization when the crucial hour came and reveal his true face. Now, Achibe makes an analysis whether according to the colonial powers, whether the educated native was better or the uh, innocent, ignorant native was better. Now, did this mean that educated native was no different at all from his brother in the bush? Oh no, he was different. He was worse. His abortive effort at education and culture, though leaving him totally unredeemed and unregenerated, had nonetheless done something to him. It had deprived him of his links with his own people, whom he no longer even understood, and who certainly wanted none of his dissatisfaction and pretensions. So, the knowledge that the colonial powers had about Africa made them think that they are superior and they knew better than the native Africans themselves. For this, Achibe gives the example of a writer by the name Iris Andreski, and he says Iris Andreski's book is more than old wives' tales, at least in intention. It is clearly inspired by the desire to undercut the educated African witness and uh, saying that the unspoiled woman of the bush who has retained a healthy gratitude for Europe's intervention in Africa better. This desire accounts for all that reliance one finds in modern European travelers' tales on the evidence of simple natives, houseboys, cooks, drivers, school children, supposedly more trustworthy than smart Alex. So, the European works about African people always said that the uneducated people, native people, were more trustworthy than the educated ones. So Achibe also quotes one of his essays, Where Angels Fear to Tread, which he published in the year 1962, in which he suggested that the European critique of African literature must cultivate the habit of humility appropriate to his limited experience of the African world and purged of the superiority and arrogance which history so insidiously makes him heir to. So he said that about African, the colonial powers or the European critic don't know much. So they have to restrict their writing to the limited knowledge they have, and they shouldn't claim that they know everything. They shouldn't impose superiority or arrogance on the native writers. This article, however, won him bitter enemies. That is what he says. According to Achebe, every literature must seek the things that belong to its place, must, in other words, speak of a particular place, evolve out of the necessities of its history, past and current, and the aspirations and destiny of its people. The work of a Western writer is automatically informed by universality. It is only others who must train to achieve it. So, the European writers always thought that that their work appealed to everybody, and the Africans should follow that method. He makes fun of it and says, as though universality were some distant bend in the road which you may take if you travel out far enough in the direction of Europe and America. If you put adequate distance between yourself and your home. So, why should the African write to the whole world when it has its own purpose? Achibe writes, I should like to see the word universal banned altogether from the discussions of African literature until such a time as people cease to use it as synonym for the narrow self-serving parochialism of Europe until their horizon extends to include all of the world. Now the Europeans are narrow-minded, and why should they write the works that appeal to universal audience? He says the work of Philip M. Allen is a brilliant example of colonialist criticism. Of course, a good deal of colonialist rhetoric always turned on that very question, the moral inferiority of colonized people, of which subjugation was a prime consequence and penalty. Achebe gives the example of English novelist John Buchan, who wrote a colonialist classic, Prester John, in which we find the words, I quote, that the difference between white and black, the gift of responsibility, unquote. And the idea did not originate with Buchan either. It was a foundation tenet of colonialism and a recurrent element of its ideology and rhetoric. So the blacks lacked responsibility was there from the beginning. This idea was there in the mind of the colonial rulers from the beginning. Now, if you tell a black man that he is incapable of assuming responsibility for himself and his actions, he would think that it is the greatest insult to him, and to get over the insult he will do anything. And he will even agree, for instance, that the role of racism in African history was his own fault. Achebe says this is complete and utter nonsense. For whatever faults the black man may have, or whatever crimes he committed, he did not bring racism into the world. And no matter how emancipated a man may wish to appear, or how anxious to please by his largeness of the heart, he cannot make history simply go away. He says, for colonialism itself was built on the idea of proselyte, uh, proselytization. That is, it means to convert people to another religion. For colonialism itself was built on an ideology which, despite many setbacks, survives into our own day, and indeed is ready again at the end of a quiescent phase of self doubt for a new resurgence of proselytization, even as in the past among its prime victims. The first nationalists and freedom fighters in the colonies, hardly concerned to oblige their imperial masters, were offensively earnest. They had no choice. They needed to alter the arrangement which kept them and their people out of rain and the heat of sun. They fought and won many victories. They changed a few things and seemed to secure certain powers of action over others. So, after a long period of colonial rule, the natives rebelled over such a rule and fought for their freedom. He says in Nigeria, people say that it was benign colonialism, but it required a monumental demonstration of all nationalist organization in the territory after a particularly blatant incident of racism in a Lagos hotel to compel the administration into token relaxation of the practice whereby whites and blacks lived in segregated residential areas. To levy the charges of underdevelopment against African writers today may prove as misguided and uninformed as a similar dismissal of African art by visitors of an earlier age before coming of Picasso. Now, here Achebe says we must not blame the African writers of being underdeveloped, because similar claims were made against the artists in a very long time ago. Those worthy men saw little good around them, only childlike and grotesque distortions. Frank Willett, in his excellent book on African art, tells us of one such visitor to Benin in 1701, a certain David Nyandil. When this man came to Africa in the year 1701, he saw the artworks that they were making, and he said, I quote, so wretchedly carved that it is hardly possible to distinguish whether they are most like men or beasts, notwithstanding which my guides were able to distinguish them into merchants, soldiers, wild beast hunters, etc. Unquote. So, after many centuries later, when some other Europeans came, they saw that the same artwork which Nightingale complained of were like masterpieces. That is what he says. If the artists of Benin and of Congo and Angola had agreed with Nightingale in 1701 and abandoned their vision and began to make their images with the style of developed Portugal, would they have not committed a grave disservice to Africa and ultimately to Europe herself and the rest of the world? Because they did not, it so happened that after the passage of 2 centuries, other Europeans, more sensitive by far than Nightingale, looked at their work again and learnt from it a new way to see the world. Similarly, he says the musical form of jazz was something which the Africans developed from discarded musical instruments of their masters. This is what we find in the essay. The colonialist critic, unwilling to accept the validity and sensibilities other than his own, has made particular point of dismissing the African novel. He has written lengthy articles to prove the non-existence of the African novel. He says that the novel is a peculiarly Western genre, a fact which would interest us if our ambition was to write Western novels. But in any case, did not the black people in America, deprived of their own musical instruments, take trumpet and trombone and blow them as they had never been blown before, and indeed they were not designed to be blown, and the result was it not jazz? Is anyone going to say that this was a loss to the world, or that those first Negro slaves who began to play around with the discarded instruments of their masters should have played some other music instrument? No, let every people bring their gifts to the great festival of the world's cultural harvest, and mankind will be all the richer for the variety and distinctiveness of their offerings. Thank you.